Hey everybody, it's Erik, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Village Global Venture Stories. I'm here today joined by a very special returning guest, Noah Smith. Noah, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
So Noah, about a year ago, we spoke about higher education and what was happening going on there, especially because of COVID. Reflecting a year later and sort of, I imagine people are going to be back for school in the fall. What have we learned about sort of the state of higher ed, after COVID?
Unfortunately, I think that a lot of my glummer predictions are starting to come true. You're seeing drops in enrollment. You're seeing a lot of drops in staff hiring at colleges. Yeah. And of course, it's the weaker colleges that are getting hurt more. I do think that some of the eagerness to, say, not use SATs in admissions by some of the state schools as a way to keep up enrollment in the face of declining demand. We did see a pretty large bailout of colleges with Biden's COVID relief bill that passed earlier this year. So, So that's going to last for 1 year. So colleges will be okay. The question is long-term demand. The question is, are people going to realize wait a second, I'm paying all this money and I just took some Zoom classes, maybe it's not worth it. So that could happen. I also think that, a lot of smaller colleges are just kind of going to go bust.
Yeah.
And so I think my predictions are unfortunately coming true, although the federal bailout did happen. So that'll cushion some of it.
Is it directionally accurate to lump education, housing, and healthcare? And Mark Andreessen would say that the big challenge is that government restricts supply, or regulations restrict supply, and subsidize demand, and as a result, quality stagnates and price increases, and we can't bend the cost curve until the regulations let up, or we just have enough tech innovation to lower them. What's missing there?
Well, okay. So when you're talking about education, I mean, that's a great description for housing in the city centers in America. In terms of healthcare, I would say it's much different than what he describes, because healthcare, we don't really restrict supply that much. It's not a factor of there's these things that we don't allow, like where you don't allow construction in cities, but with healthcare, it's not that. We do subsidize it though. With education, it's a little trickier because there are government requirements for accreditation or whatever, but there's so many already accredited schools that can expand as much as they want. Like Stanford University, Harvard University, they were accredited 1 billion years ago, and there's absolutely zero regulation preventing them from building 20 satellite campuses with the Harvard brand. Becoming the Olive Garden of higher education. Any of these accredited institutions, of which we have literally hundreds of them, could do this. And so in terms of restricting supply, if you think the only real regulation is accreditation for new universities, but you can make infinite branch universities from the people who are already accredited, and they don't. And so that's the question. So that's why I don't think restriction of supply is a big deal in education either. I think, let me rephrase that. I think government restriction of supply is not a big deal. I think that endogenous restriction of supply for the purpose of pumping up prestige, that's why Harvard doesn't build out, right? Yeah. Because they want this elite prestige factor, because what they're going for is not actually price. It's not a private company that wants to maximize total revenue. They're fine. If it maximized prestige, they'd have 3 students per year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I understand Harvard and Princeton and whatnot, but if you're some, C-list university, you're accredited. I mean, do we have some examples of people who've done, just gone mass market, global, bunch of satellite offices and just said, hey, we're just going to play a numbers game? And
no, but I mean, you do have tons of universities that had extensions and branches and whatnot that have been pretty successful. I mean, the University of California system, and especially the Cal State system, have just been extremely effective. That's not even, private. It's hard to say government versus private anymore, because government universities are only 20% funded by the government.
Yeah.
They're 80%, funded by tuition or alumni contributions. So, or whatever, other private stuff. So it's are they really government when there's just 20%? I don't know. Government's just like kicking in a little cash to these guys. But there have been lots of expansions in like the Cal State system, which has done great. Cal State provides the best value for money. Cal State and CUNY are the two systems that every state in the nation should be trying to emulate those. And we think about higher education in terms of like Harvard and Stanford and blah, blah, blah. But I think we just have to realize that those people are so into eliteness and prestige that in terms of mass education, in terms of, just providing actual dollars for value for dollars for like the average American, Harvard's never going to do it. No matter how much Matthew Iglesias yells at them, they're never going to do it. And Stanford's never going to do it. Actually, Stanford might do it, but it would be very difficult to get their attention and get them to do this.
It's the higher ed equivalent of NIMBYism or something.
Sort of. Yeah. I mean, like NIMBYism is restricting supply. It's like if you look at the local homeowners, they're restricting supply so that their own real estate prices and rents that they charge to people can get pumped up. Right? Landlords are the worst NIMBYs. If you look at all these people, like, so-called lefty people saying that like new housing construction will actually raise rents or some bullshit like that, they're all a bunch of slumlords. They just want to pump up their rents they can charge. So anyway, so it's but Harvard doesn't have the ability to restrict college spots in America overall. They could only restrict spots to Harvard. And that's fine because we don't need Harvard. Like you can have anybody can do this. You can just build more campuses, take in more people. The problem is that education is this weird market where you don't actually know what value you've gotten from it until like it's already too late and it's like late in your career. So it's this, it's so reputation based. Because nobody actually can tell. Like, if I go and get a sandwich, I know what I'm eating right now. If I use a piece of software, I know what I'm using right now. If I go get an education, I don't know how useful it was until like my career's over. And so,
So if in housing, we just need to build more, and in universities, we just need to,
I do think we need to build more. It's just not government allowing building more. That's the key.
What in healthcare do we need to do then? What's the solution there?
Oh, just like, bombing raids on hospital. No, I'm kidding. So healthcare, Andreessen's not going to like that I say this, but national health insurance is the way to go because the national health insurance system can bargain down prices. So the problem is our prices are just way too high. We just get overcharged for everything. And there's a lot of ways you can try to deal with this, but competition just doesn't do it in healthcare. And there's a lot of reasons why, and I can go into the reasons, but then competition just, it works for a lot of things. I don't know, life insurance is super cheap now, and then it even works in some parts of healthcare. Like LASIK. LASIK. LASIK's really cheap because there's competition. The thing is that as soon as you have things like chronic conditions or we have life-threatening conditions or things like that, or like lifestyle, basically diabetes or like heart attacks or something, like competition doesn't really work with this. And, if you're having a heart attack, you don't think about what hospital you go to. You're completely like price insensitive. You go to the nearest hospital, you can't have 20 hospitals on a block. So the local effect of hospitals, the local monopoly is really important for emergency services. And for anyway, there's just a bunch of empirical observations and theoretical reasons to match those observations showing why competition doesn't work in a lot of the healthcare sector. There's also adverse selection. There's moral hazard. There's a lot of weird stuff going on there. And so every country that has like a high quality healthcare system that gets it for cheap does this kind of the same thing, which is not the Bernie Sanders thing. It's not nationalize the whole industry. What they do is they have a national healthcare system that pays, I don't know, something like 70% of the costs. Unless you're like really old or poor, in which case it'll subsidize you more because they're nice. That's redistribution. But then basically they pay 70% of the costs, but you're still stuck with the other 30%. And in exchange for paying 70% of the costs, they get the authority to sort of negotiate down prices. And in Japan, it's like very explicit. They just sort of get in a room and say, this is what the price will be. Council of Doctors declares this is the price you can charge. But then, of course, we would do it differently. We would just have, Medicare is the Medicare system is actually really good at determining prices. So we take Medicare, which is the system that works really well for seniors. Seniors, it's not a monopoly. It's not nationalization. Seniors do have Medigap. They have private supplemental insurance. They have, deductibles, copays and whatever. And that controls costs. And so, because you're not just like throwing infinite money at whatever people want to spend on, as Bernie would do. And so Medicare is really good at negotiating down prices. And if you look at the same services, they looked at the exact same services and compare the price Medicare gets to the price other like private insurers or whatever smaller people get. And, Medicare is just beating them all. Like even Kaiser, Medicare can get a lower price, and negotiating powers is the biggest part of that. And so I don't want to nationalize the health insurance system or abolish private health insurance, but having a national health insurer that can just bargain those prices down is really valuable. I think that Japan and Korea's system is the system we want to copy.
Got it. I want to segue into a different topic, which is in the aughts, people were concerned about, or Silicon Valley, people were concerned about singularity. In the last few years, people have been, coalescing around the great stagnation, and then, most recently, people have been asking, is the great stagnation potentially ending soon? Is there reason to be excited? So let me just zoom out and say, were you on board with how sort of Tyler described the great stagnation? And I'm curious for your take on how did it happen? Was it a mismeasuring, and when will we know when it's over?
Right. It did happen. The productivity in America slowed down dramatically around 1973. So the website "What the Fuck Happened in 1971" is slightly misnamed. It was 73.
And what happened in 1973?
The oil shock.
Got it.
And so we had, if you look back at what our leading industries, really our tech industries at that time were based on, they were based on using a lot of oil to make very big, powerful engines of things and more energy sucking appliances for your house. That was tech. Everything was just very energy intensive. And so the abrupt, but that was disguising a problem that had been building for years. So when we switched to oil, when we switched from coal to oil in like the 10s, 20s ish, it was a massive bonanza for productivity. And when people ask why was the Great Depression actually the biggest increase for productivity ever, I bet it's just because of shifting to oil. We shifted everything to oil because oil was super cheap. It was energy dense. You could just easily pull it out of the ground and transport it anywhere. And you could carry it around with you, which is harder for coal. So we switched, the Industrial Revolution happened when we switched from like wood to coal, right? Wood and animal fat to coal. And then we switched to oil. And I think that was I forget if they call it the second or third Industrial Revolution, whatever the internal combustion engine / everything is electrified revolution. Everything's electrified, actually, we did with coal, but then we allowed, oil for other things. Internal combustion was big. So we had this big shift, but then the next thing was supposed to be nuclear, and it never happened. And we can argue about why it never happened, and people will be like, oh, because people were too cautious and government regulation, blah, blah, blah. And other people are like, no, it's because the financing was just too expensive. Government had to actually foot the bill for all these reactors, and, they weren't willing to do it. Other people are like, no, it's unsafe, blah, 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 Chernobyl, blah, blah, blah. Whatever your preferred explanation for why we didn't switch to nuclear fission as our big next thing, it didn't happen. And so that is just the fact. And I mean, it happened a little bit more in France.
Right.
But overall, we didn't find ourselves in the nuclear age like we expected to in the 50s. And because of that, I mean, nuclear fuel is incredibly dense, energy dense. I really like energy density, but it is limited because it doesn't count the volume of the extraction machinery. So you can have like a battery powered leaf blower that's actually a lot smaller than a gas powered leaf blower because the mechanism, the engine, the internal combustion engine is bigger. Anyway, but the point is that nuclear was just so super dense. Nuclear submarines run forever, right? Yeah. We could, and so the fact that we didn't shift to nuclear like cars, was that ever going to happen? I don't know, but you can say we should have shifted to nuclear reactors for power to replace coal, but it's hard to argue we would have ever gone to nuclear cars.
Right.
No one, I mean, I think the Soviet Union did think about it, and they were like, even the Soviet Union was like, no. and so nuclear cars never happened. And so we've been coasting. And after World War II, which really was a war for oil more than people realize, we won World War II. And as a result, oil was very cheap for the whole world for like a couple decades after World War II. We had this big productivity boom. Do you know Ben Reinhardt? He's a friend of mine.
Yeah, of course. Ben Reinhardt. Yep.
So Ben loves to show this, like, I forget, it's the Henry Adams curve or something, where like per capita energy use just goes like up and up and up and up and up in the 60s, 50s, 60s, whatever. And then in 1973, it's like because of the oil crisis, because they couldn't go on. Like, yes, I know the oil crisis was about Mideast war to begin with. Well, both were. But then really what it was about was just supplier power. It was about these guys realizing, hey, everything runs on oil and we own all the oil. Let's raise the price. And so they did that. And of course, OPEC didn't last forever. And eventually the cartel was broken. But I think that made everyone realize that the age of cheap oil is over. From then on, we entered this world of energy scarcity. And I think that's when we shifted to really going for energy, non-energy intensive technologies like IT. IT uses energy, but at least until Bitcoin, it didn't use a lot of energy.
Yeah.
And so Bitcoin we can talk about later. But then so what happened was you had the shift from like classic sci-fi to cyberpunk. You had everything being about bits instead of atoms. And then people just gave up the idea of cheaper and cheaper energy. And then we had to retool for a while, but then starting and really the IT boom started in the 80s, and I think people don't realize that, but it really got going in the 90s, and it started showing up big in all the productivity statistics, and we got this decade and a half of high productivity growth back basically from IT and the IT revolution, and then that petered out really abruptly in 2004. Or 5. I mean, so 4 was like the last year of high productivity growth, and then 2005 it was like just craters, and it's not clear why that happened. I don't know why it happened, but it happened. And so that's the quote unquote great stagnation. And it of course coincides with other trends and things like education flattening out. When you can educate your populace more and more, you keep getting more and more productive workers. But then when you start like educating them into their 30s, you're eating into too much of their productive life. And you just can't give them more years of education. We can try to improve the quality of it. We can't just keep giving everybody more years and demand everyone get a PhD or something. It just doesn't work. Although I guess it does work in data science. Like, okay, so that maybe, but in general, that's really tough to keep increasing education. Also, our population started to age more. A lot of things happened, but then there was some sort of technological stagnation that probably set in around 2005 and around much of the world. And it's not clear why that happened. And so that is the great stagnation. But Tyler was always really subtle about this because Tyler always said, it's going to end. This isn't going to last forever. And I think that there's no force of the universe that makes productivity grow at a constant exponential rate forever. It doesn't build on itself in, like a reproductive model. There's no, it doesn't even build on itself like capital does. I mean, you can use capital to produce more capital. So that's why exponential growth is like typically a thing. There's no real reason why productivity has to grow exponentially.
When will we know if it's over? And what are you, I know you wrote a post recently questioning your optimism.
Right.
Talk a bit about that.
Well, it's always good to be questioning yourself, but I'm still optimistic. We'll know it's over about 10 years after it starts to end. And so Robert Solow famously said, you can see the computer revolution everywhere, but in the productivity statistics. And I think that was in 1987. If you look at now, 10 years after he wrote that, everyone was interested in like the 70s and early 80s history of Silicon Valley when all this stuff was being invented. So it takes a while for this stuff to actually make it into the productivity numbers. But I think that we can guess and we can be hopeful. Of course, AI is the thing everybody's interested in. It's like suddenly we learned how to run much more effective regressions on everything. And like, I don't know how that happened. And I'm not sure anyone knows how that happened, but it happened. So that's cool. So mRNA, of course, just saved us from the pandemic. After like everything else failed to save us from the pandemic, along comes some scientists and just bam. And then tomorrow they're vaccinating for cancer. And so that's a big deal. It's gonna help a lot. CRISPR, of course, is coming. We'll be able to engineer everybody with natural purple eyes. That's going to be a big productivity boost.
Geothermal?
I don't know about geothermal, but solar and batteries are the biggie. And that's why I saved the best for last. That is the giant general purpose technology that's going to change our world, because everybody right now thinks about solar and batteries in the old framework of green energy. They think of it as, you can get energy without carbon. No climate change. And then, we can like get the eco-socialists to shut up, possibly eventually. So then, yes. And then we also don't roast ourselves, and California doesn't burn down with wildfires, although it probably will in the interim. But anyway, the point being that that's how we think about solar and batteries. We think about it in the framework of green energy. But in fact, And if you follow Ramez Nam, who's the best guy ever, just in general,
Yeah.
Ramez was on this before anybody else. And green energy is now cheap energy. So solar and batteries have passed the point where they're just good for reducing carbon emissions, and they're now actually giving us cheaper energy. So like to build out solar plants in many places is actually cheaper than to continue to operate your old existing coal plants. That's nuts. That's insanely cheap. And battery cars are still not quite as good energy-wise as internal combustion engine cars, but they're getting there really fast. And there's scaling effects where if companies just build a lot, it gets cheaper. And there's also efficiency. So battery efficiency has doubled. That's a really big deal. And then that's even discounting all the sort of whiz bang new inventions that are coming in the pipeline, like solid state batteries might happen. And if that happens, it's just another giant leap. And then you've got 10 more years of progress, at least right there, 15 years, whatever. And so it's really hard to predict their future of technology. I mean, Moore's law is kind of this aberration where like, oh, we observe this one-dimensional increase in this one thing that keeps going at this constant exponential rate that held for a few decades. That's pretty cool. That's rare. That's a very rare situation. And you can see that by looking at all the other Moore's law analogs out there. And so solar and batteries are getting so damn cheap and good that they're going to give us something we haven't had since the 20s, which is a newer, a better form of energy, actually cheaper energy than anything that has gone before. And so I think Adam's innovation is going to come back. And I think the point that I realized this was when I was watching a video of, remember the Portland protests, and Trump sent these federal agents out to Portland to like fight the kids, right? And they're led by a guy named Chad Wolf. And so you can't make this shit up. And then so anyway, Chad Wolf sends his guys out to Portland. And they stand in front of this courthouse that they think like the kids are going to burn, and they like fight them off with tear gas and stuff. And then the kids bring, and of course these kids are like 30, but whatever. These kids bring electric leaf blowers to the protests and blow the tear gas back at the federal agents who have to run away from their own tear gas. But they didn't predict that because you couldn't do that because a gas-powered leaf blower, is too big and unwieldy to bring out, and a cord leaf blower, there's nowhere to plug it in. And so instead, batteries changed it. And then I think the other thing that made me realize this is there was this film called Slaughterbots. I'm sorry, Slaughterbots. Do you see that?
No.
Right. So it's about assassin quadcopters, assassin drones. You just program it with facial recognition, show it somebody's face, it goes around and it just like explodes on them and they die.
Yeah.
Oh no. Bad. So that's going to be a real problem. But understanding that, like the fact that we can just fill the air and the world with tiny little electric battery powered things. And that's where this energy density thing I was talking about comes in, because you're looking at, batteries are so much less energy dense than oil. And yet you're able to make so much smaller things with batteries that work. And so drones are big and electric appliances are big. Electric cars are obviously big. I mean, Elon Musk is richer than God now. He's doing a leveraged buyout of God, I hear. And so then, like, that's huge. Yeah, so it's just really, I'm so excited about this trend. I'm excited about all these technologies. I'm most excited about that one.
Yeah. And so Patrick Olson and Michael Nielsen came out with this post a few years ago about, science slowing down. Were you sympathetic with that argument? I guess what I'm curious about is how much of it is the science or the tech that's been slowing down versus our ability to commercialize it, or has it just been both?
Oh, so that's a really good question. So first of all, I'm about to write a post soon, which will be the last in like a multi-post series in which I sort of rebut stagnation arguments. So Patrick and Michael overstated their case, I think. I think that there isn't actually evidence that science is slowing down. And I take issue with some of the evidence that they present, because I think that some of those measures naturally tend to be past biased. For example, Nobel Prize winners, we would expect, so Nobel Prize winning is a queue. You can only give it to like 3 people per year, right? And you can only give it while people are alive. So if you had an accelerating rate of discovery, you'd see the people who get the prizes get older and older as the queue gets longer and longer, right? So then, and of course, eventually the system completely collapses because everyone dies before they can get their prize, and then they have to make it all posthumous. But then, and change the will. of Nobel. But anyway, the point is that like that's actually consistent with accelerating innovation is the increasing age of Nobel Prize winners. And so a lot of the other things, like when you just go around asking people like when were the great discoveries become greater as they get built on more and become more foundational. You're not foundational the day that the discovery is made. Yeah. You're just new and cool. But you become foundational when people figure out a thing to do with it. Like the first people who made like electric current, they're like, oh, neat, I can shock myself. But like, I can make this jar fizz or something. But like then, now of course it's fundamental to everything. So that's also past biased. And so those are the points I'm going to make. But I think there is something, worrying that's happening along those lines, which is actually we're probably keeping science going at about the same rate, but it's costing us more and more. So there's evidence that the rate of that the cost of technological progress is going up. And we can still keep it going by shoveling in more and more money, although the Endless Frontier Act just kind of got gutted, which makes me really mad. And we can continue doing that for, I would say, 30 more years easily. We can just keep shoveling more money at this stuff. It's not that expensive. We spend a lower percent of GDP on R&D than we used to. We can just go back to that old percentage. It's not going to eat our entire economy, but for the long term, that's a big worry. It's not what happened in 2005, I think, but it's a long-term worry. And so I think in the more generalized sense, Patrick and Michael's concerns are right. It's just that it hasn't happened yet.
Yep.
But the signs are there.
Yeah. When Peter Thiel talks about his analyses for the Great Stagnation, I think he talks about regulation and culture. And I heard from you more, demographics, the part about energy, education. Do you less weight those things than Peter weighs them, perhaps?
Well, I don't know. Economics sort of is a cult that indoctrinates you not to believe that culture is important on its own, and to think that like economic stuff determines cultural stuff. It's just a response to economics. So I naturally think that way because I was indoctrinated into that cult in graduate school. But that said, I think a more nuanced and a fairer version of that statement is not that culture doesn't autonomously happen and affect things, but that it's really, really hard to measure those effects, to predict those effects, and to observe those effects. Culture probably does make a big amount of difference. But I'll tell you, when I moved to Japan, I found that Japanese culture was insanely different from what people said it was.
Yeah.
Even from what people in Japan said it was. Like Japanese theorists of Japanese culture are just as sort of, kind of, I don't know, diluted as like, I don't know, Tom Cotton saying something about Western civilization or something here. It's like, have you taken a walk in Western civilization lately? Do you know what it's like? It's, it's people don't get out that much. And so I found Japanese culture to be, for example, extremely individualistic when almost everyone on the planet says Japanese culture is collectivist. I was like, right. No. And that was like the biggest one. It was like Japanese people were more likely than Americans to go off and noodle off and do their own thing.
Interesting.
Whether it came to fashion or work or anything, like it was more difficult to get Japanese people. Well, I don't want to generalize. I don't want to start pulling out cultural stereotypes, but then I would say that Japanese people would be more likely to follow codes and like rules.
Yeah.
And I remember my ex-girlfriend got a new camera, and I remembered watching with utter amazement as before she opened the camera, she read the entire manual. She RTFM'd. Like she just sat down and read it like a book, and then it's okay, I'm ready to use this camera now. Oh, what the hell is that? And like an American would be like, throw away the manual, open the thing. Then if I can't figure out something, Google a PDF of the manual.
Yeah.
Or just ask a forum. Like that's what we do. I think Americans are generally, and again, this is just big generalizations based on personal experience. Americans are much more likely to like look at what their neighbor's doing. Yeah. Whereas Japanese people are much more likely to like look at the code, look at the manual, the procedure. And so but that's anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You can't tell about culture.
Right.
Like that's the thing. Like it probably exists, but it's like so hard to measure and observe. Anyway.
You touched on it a little bit in your Patrick Collison interview was great. I'm curious if after that interview, I guess it's been a couple of months, if there were any other disagreements you had with some of his points or any sort of reflections you've had on some of the topics that you discussed in the interview.
I mean, I think that he has successfully convinced me that sort of like government funding processes for science are more broken than I realized. I always knew that there were all these problems, with grant writing and stuff, but then he has raised a lot of problems. And I don't know if he invented those ideas or got them from, the various bloggers who work on this, like Jose Luis, I forget his whole name, that Nintel, the blogger Nintel, which he just goes by Nintel. But anyway, but yeah, so like that has broadly convinced me.
Yeah.
I'm convinced, but I'm also convinced that we wouldn't be talking about the problems in science funding and things like that if it was still super cheap to just pick the low-hanging fruit of innovation.
Right.
So I think that the science slowing down thing is why we're trying to like wring out, some efficiency gains from the existing system.
Yeah.
Because it's getting more and more expensive to keep throwing money at it.
Speaking of sort of, efficiency, let's talk about monetary policy and inflation. Why are people thinking the wrong way about inflation, or what's sort of the right way to think about it? Make sense of inflation and what's
yeah. So I think that when people think about inflation, they often think about like specific price of stuff, the price of lumber, the price of used cars. Those are important, but to be honest, that kind of inflation is never very big, and it doesn't last that long. The energy shocks were a bit of a special case because we were so oil dependent and oil went up for so much for so long that it was the most significant sort of cost push shock in a single commodity or whatever. But stuff like the price of lumber is never going to cause big sustained inflation. The only thing that would really cause big sustained inflation is if the Fed decided that it wasn't interested in restraining inflation, and if an episode like that, with this brief transient shock of lumber prices and car prices or whatever, exposed the fact that the Fed was no longer an inflation fighter. If that happened and everyone was like, oh my God, the Fed no longer cares about inflation, then inflation could actually happen, like big, damaging, serious long-term inflation. And so, that's the only thing I'm scared of. So as long as the Fed is not willing to let inflation happen, inflation won't happen.
Yeah. Do you agree with, should the Fed basically adopt Scott Sumner's recommendations around GDP level targeting?
It doesn't matter. The truth is that the Fed will not stick to any rule that it officially adopts. So there was this, Sumner came through an intellectual tradition that was very focused on monetary policy rules, constraining the Fed with rules. That has been pretty much debunked. Rules will always give way to discretion. The Fed will always say, well, this week we're getting yelled at because the economy is bad. Let's do some QE. This week we're getting yelled at because inflation is bad. Let's raise some rates. That's really how the Fed works. Like they respond to popular pressure, but not because they're worried about like people getting mad at them. It's because they actually care. Like if people are upset about inflation, the Fed will get upset out of empathy. I think they're better people than you think. But then the Fed will never follow like a simple rule like that. It just won't.
Yeah. There's this blogger, Lynn Alden, who basically argues that her case is, she says we'll see sort of runaway inflation, maybe not now, maybe not next few years, but at some point, basically because her argument is that whenever sovereign debt to GDP has reached over 130%, 51 out of 52 times that debt was not paid back in real terms, meaning there was inflation. And I think the only time in which there wasn't, it was Japan, and that had a very different economic situation. Does that sound reasonable to you?
So I don't know about these rules and cutoffs and stuff like that. Yeah. That's cherry picked. But then also it all comes from like previous, something's different about Japan. If you have slow productivity growth, if you have slow population growth, especially or population shrinkage, it's just a lot. Also, whether you own the debt, whether you owe the debt externally or internally. So like if Japan owes all its debt to Japanese people, the Japanese government. And so all the people on the hook for that debt are Japanese because they're Japanese taxpayers, right? And all the people who are owed the debt are Japanese. So simply reshuffling claims between Japanese people would make the debt go poof, right? Most of these cases, almost all these cases, are cases where the borrowing was external. So I wouldn't look at like specific cutoffs like that. But that said, I do think that the scary case for inflation is if the Fed starts either, directly monetarily financing government deficits or indirectly financing it by keeping interest rates essentially zero. So the Treasury, so the federal government can sort of roll over its debt infinitely at zero cost. And so that's if the Fed commits to keeping interest rates low so that the government can costlessly roll over its debt, that's a thing called fiscal dominance. And so that could make the Fed weak on inflation. And then everyone's like, oh God, the Fed's not controlling inflation. Raise prices. And so that could happen. And so I think that government debt, the Fed sort of becoming complicit in infinite government borrowing is the scary scenario, no matter which form it comes in.
Yeah.
And then, so I think that the worry about government debt and the interaction between debt and monetary policy is exactly right. But I wouldn't necessarily pick like a solid threshold like that.
Yeah. You've written about why climate economics has failed. And I'm curious for you to unpack that argument. I'm also curious for your perspective on Andrew McAfee's book, More from Less, where basically it argues that as countries industrialize, they have more energy, usage, and it's tied with consumption. But when they reach a certain level of wealth, it starts to uncouple, and it actually starts to reverse. And I'm curious if you think that that's accurate.
Well, he's right about that. That doesn't have a hell of a lot to do with why climate economics failed. Well, maybe a little bit tangentially. Well, but yeah, I mean, Andy's right about that.
Cool.
Like there is decoupling. We need a little bit more decoupling than has happened. We need it to happen earlier within the industrialization process. So countries need to start industrializing using solar power from day one instead of switching to it once they get rich. And they need to, unfortunately, that's been made possible by the cheapness of it. And so India now is like switching to solar power really rapidly, not because India gives a shit, but because because it's cheaper.
Yeah.
And they'll do what's cheap. And so that's a big deal. About the failure of climate economics, that's a really interesting question. So the reason climate economics didn't have a lot of useful things to say for many decades, and now is just barely starting to get to the point where they have interesting things to say. But the reason they didn't was because economists view the world in terms of trade-offs and are taught. Remember the economist cult that I'm part of? Well, One of the elements of that cult is always thinking in terms of trade-offs. We've got to find this interior solution. And this can lead economists astray. So, for example, maybe there's ways we can like help people out of poverty that will also make them more productive, like that basic income experiment in Stockton ended up actually making people work full-time more. Economists don't like free lunches, but free lunches sometimes exist. And so that's a free lunch. It's not free because you got to get tax money or whatever to pay for it, but you don't have this trade-off between income and employment. You don't have this thing where you give people $500 a month or whatever, or a week, or I don't even remember how much. I don't remember whether it was a month or a week. Might have been a week. You give them a bunch of money and then they work more. Amazing. No trade-off. It was just a freebie. Economists don't like that. They don't like making models where that happens because it's too easy. Economists don't like doing easy things. They like doing hard things that allow them to sort of signal that they're math jocks and be like, mathier than thou. And that's how they get prestige. Like with, Harvard or something, I don't know. But so economists wanted to think that there was a trade-off between the environment and the economy. Technology obviates that trade-off. It doesn't obviate the trade-off, but it makes the trade-off far less severe. So in a world of cheap solar and batteries, there's just far less environmental damage you have to do to keep your economy running. Yes, there's going to be some like chemical runoff from mines and whatnot, but like the amount of environmental damage that will be done for a given amount of GDP will be much lower. So, and the point is that funding the development of technology can actually make the technology happen. There's evidence that until about the year 2000, it was government funding that drove cost declines in solar. And then after that, it was private investment and scaling effects that drove cost declines in solar. But then for 30 years, it was just government. Had government not been pumping money into solar research, we would not be where we are today on the verge of a new energy and atoms technology revolution.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what economists got wrong. They thought that their role was to caution people not to let climate change get too severe and not to let anti-climate change regulations get too severe either. When in fact, there was like stuff they completely ignored that you could do that could make regulations less strict, even as it made the economy better.
I want to segue. We were talking about demographics earlier, and you've written a little bit about this, but I mean, and a lot of people have. Why do rich people have fewer kids? Or why as countries get richer, why does their fertility rates decline?
Oh, so there's a number of reasons. One is because women's education and access to contraception is the big driver of fertility declines. Women never wanted to have 5 kids each. Like they do not want that inherently. That is a pain in the ass. And it prevents you from like having a career. It more importantly, it probably kills you. I don't know. I mean, like it's a giant burden. Women really wanted to have like 2 kids. Men, they didn't care how many kids they had because they just impregnate the women and be like, okay, your problem, woman. Maybe they'd pay for it if they had the money. But then when women get education contraception, like, hey, I don't have to, make just babies for you my whole life. And then they don't because, it's contraception, education, or women's liberation in this way. The other thing is that in poor countries, you have people move from farms to cities. That really reduces fertility a lot because you don't need kids to work the farm anymore.
Right.
Kids were like auto-generated farm hands. It was like having a kid in like an agricultural, situation is like building an android to do your farming for you. Remember at the beginning of Star Wars, that's Luke Skywalker. They're like, hey, no, don't go off fighting evil. Sit around doing farm labor for us. And then the stormtrooper's like, no, we kill you. And that's how he gets out of it. But like that's why people have kids in poor agrarian countries. So those are the 2 biggest factors in why fertility changes. There's other factors like it gets expensive to have a kid, or like, more of your kids survive, so you don't have to have a bunch of kids as like an insurance policy to make sure you have someone to take care of you in old age when infant mortality and child mortality go down. There's other reasons too, and they all correlate with income.
Yeah, I wonder if like the environment, if there's a decoupling that happens as people become even wealthier, or like could that trend reverse as people get wealthy, or unlikely?
I don't know. The answer is that nobody really knows about this. Like demographers don't know. My bet is that artificial womb technology, like in the books of Lois McMaster Bujold, would make a big difference here.
Yeah. I want to take you to another post you had where you describe an exchange between Nickel and Pinker, and you say that Nickel is critiquing Pinker for claiming that free market economics has reduced global poverty.
You mean Hickel?
Hickel, sorry. Yes, Hickel. Can you unpack that and you basically say both are wrong. Can you unpack that exchange and why you think they're both wrong?
That's right. So a lot of people look at so until around 1980, rich countries were pulling away from poor countries. The rate had decelerated a bit, which they were pulling away, but they were still pulling away in terms of GDP per capita. That is not what economics says should happen. Economics says if you're a poor country, there's much more opportunity at rich. I mean, just think about China, how that happened, right? Or think about taking any poor country and just having them do things the way we do them here, then they'll be rich, right? So then there's so much opportunity, and yet the rich countries were pulling away from the poor countries until around 1980. And then around 1980, it screeches to a halt and then starts slowly going in the other direction, and maybe faster now and faster. So the developing world started catching up, not evenly catching up, but catching up overall. And so you see countries like Malaysia and Poland and Turkey that are now practically developed countries, and people don't even know how to think of them anymore because they're coming up. They're like 75% of the income of like a developed country, and like they're getting there, right? They're on the cusp of developed countryness, and they certainly are industrialized. If you ask, what do these people do? Like Turkey's building cars, Poland's building cars, Malaysia's building electronics. That's what these countries are doing. And so you had this growth, and with that growth, and of course you had India, and of course you had China. And so with that growth, you got massive poverty reduction. And some people look at it and they're like, yay, capitalism. That's what it was. Of course, capitalism helped in some places. I mean, like obviously China, where you went from a command economy to a partially market economy, that was a very good change. So going capitalist actually helped China a lot. India, it's less clear. People argue back and forth about whether or not their economic liberalization is what started them on the growth path. But you could make an argument for it. And so then some countries like capitalism, adding some capitalism, is countries with a strong command economy. Adding capitalism, just great. But then a lot of these countries, like Malaysia was always capitalist, and a lot of these countries in Southeast Asia that are growing fast now were always capitalist. Not Vietnam, but like Indonesia, whatever. And so it's not capitalism per se. Also in Latin America, you've never had really rapid growth. You've had sort of like steady, slow, linear growth. But then, and Latin America is not that poor of a place. It's sort of middle income. But then Latin America had some of the highest levels of inequality in the world, and they elected leaders. They got fed up and they elected leaders who did a bunch of redistribution. And that redistribution, and also like efforts at like education and health and these things have really reduced inequality in Latin America. Not to where it needs to be, but reduced it a lot. I can't call that capitalism. So in some places like China is the best case for capitalism. Weirdly, the lefties don't like, talking about China in these statistics because they want to think China is like a successful socialist communist country, which is bullshit. When Thomas Piketty, Thomas Piketty?
Yeah, of course.
When he wrote a book about inequality in China, they banned his book, kicked him out. So China's not, I don't know what communist means, but China's not socialist.
Yeah.
And so it's pretty hyper capitalist in many ways. And so, but anyway, it's a mix of things, but to just look at this progress, so many countries did industrial policy that was very successful. To look at this progress and say, like, yeah, capitalism is just is ill-informed, or just not looking at it carefully enough.
And when you say they did industrial policy and it was very successful, what exactly did they do, or what comprises successful industrial policy?
Right. So have you read the book How Asia Works?
I've not, but that was on my list to ask you about what's
everyone read the book How Asia Works always.
That's why.
The answer is that we don't exactly know a universal formula, but the closest thing we've come is something called export discipline. So interestingly, Joe Studwell, who wrote that book, also argues for land reform in agrarian society. He says that's like the first step. But once you've done that, he says export discipline is the key. Export discipline means that you promote exports, but you don't just promote them forever. You promote them only temporarily to see who to push your domestic companies to compete in world markets and to weed out the wheat from the chaff and to see who is actually able to compete in a global market. And also doing that often requires sort of accumulating foreign technology, importing foreign technology. So you saw Korean car companies trying very, very hard to get technology from Japanese car companies. And so that export discipline also means that companies that fail in these international markets, you just completely withdraw support for and just wind them up. It's like, you sucked. So there were Korean car companies that didn't succeed, that died. Yeah. But then like Hyundai or whatever succeeded. So that, I think, is we don't know what works, but that's the closest idea we can come up with.
What do you think we should do in the U.S.?
That's a great question. I think that, first of all, we need to spend a lot more money on science. Spend a lot of money on science. Specialized technical education in local areas is a thing that localities can do. So towns that have managed to really revive themselves from like the Rust Belt and Great Recession have often invited some big companies. So like, you'll invite like a manufacturer of small aircraft, right? And then you'll provide basically like community college type schools in the area where people who are out of high school can just go to learn all the stuff you'd need to know to work in a factory like that. It's not just dumb assembly line work anymore. You need to know stuff. And so this local vocational education really prepares people for those industry specific kind of jobs. As much as Americans want everyone to go to a 4-year college and like study history, that's not happening. And most people are just going to want jobs. So that's another thing we can do besides this. I also think export discipline is just a great idea. I think that although explicit export subsidies are prohibited under World Trade Organization rules, we can do a lot of sort of like legal unofficial things, which other countries do. So we can subsidize exports a lot, but only temporarily. We can say, okay, if you're willing to start exporting, you get a boost for this many years.
And so this would restore our trade balance more at equilibrium?
I don't know that it would. I think it would help. I think the trade balance is also determined by currency issues. I think that's a big deal.
Where do you differ from the Bill Janeway and Maria Mazzucato, not necessarily to lump them in the same, but a view of the world?
So I know Mariana Mazzucato's ideas, but Janeway's pretty eclectic. What were you thinking of?
Well, just I think they both advocate for just a strong role for, public sector involvement, both in terms of taking deserves credit for the past, but also, going forward in the future. And just think that, perhaps Silicon Valley underrates how, the role of government.
I don't think deserves credit for the past is that important of a thing we need to talk about, because if government does these things, the only reason to give credit is so we remember not to have government stop doing those things. But government's incredibly important. I mean, you look at Silicon Valley, of course, the internet with DARPA, VLSI, the very large semiconductor. What's the I stand for? I forget. That was like an important sort of development in the chip world. You can just trace a lot of things to government-funded research, and I believe, was just telling Ben Reinhardt about this the other day. I believe that innovation is a pipeline, and at the beginning of the pipeline, you have like very basic discoveries like quantum mechanics, and at the very end of the pipeline, you have specific, products like a Tesla, and like there's a whole chain of more concrete applied stuff from quantum mechanics to a Tesla. But if you never had quantum mechanics, you probably wouldn't have a Tesla.
Yeah.
You'd have like, I don't know. Well, maybe you'd still have Tesla, but it would be crappier. And so there's a whole innovation supply chain. And the idea that it's government versus private sector is usually wrong. There are some sort of intermediate steps in the chain where they can substitute for each other. Like you could have Bell Labs discovering something that MIT might otherwise discover, or you can have, like in certain fields, like private sector is doing a lot of the basic research. So for example, if you look at the percentage of AI papers that are published by either Google Brain, DeepMind, or Google AI, it is like all. They're the new Bell Labs, but just for AI. So sometimes the private sector is going to do that. As you get more toward applied things, the private sector does more. Like next generation chip stuff is like really deep electrical engineering stuff, but it's being done by like Intel, TSMC, whatnot. And that's just that's research. And so, but then if you look at things like quantum mechanics or whatever, like very basic stuff, the structure of DNA, that's all government.
Yeah. Or
just people tinkering around for fun on their own, which is even more basic than government. And then when you look at stuff like products that it's almost all, it's pretty much all private.
Yeah.
And in between, it sort of shades from more government to more private. But I guess, and of course, there's a simple, easy principle for understanding why this happens, which is capturability. So the less capturable thing is, the more it will be done by the government, or not at all.
Yeah.
Because if you can't, look at Bell Labs, look at Xerox PARC. They're like, I think they still exist nominally, but like those organizations are effectively dead. And it's because their innovations did make some money for their companies, but not enough to maybe justify the research outlay.
Yeah.
And so there's an interesting paper about the decline of private labs. And it's like, well, private labs, like they did a great job at discovering things. It just wasn't necessarily worthwhile for the companies, because you discover something and then your competitor ends up using it. That's what is real, the scary part is the competition. The more something can leak out, the less capturable it is, and the more government needs to come in and do it, which is because government doesn't care about the credit. In fact, the defining feature of government is that it doesn't care about the credit.
Yeah.
Shouldn't anyway.
That's really interesting criteria. When we talk about the MMTers, what do they get right and what do they get wrong?
Well, so you have to understand MMT is not really an economic theory. There's no actual economic theory there. There's a set of statements and declarations like there is no government budget constraint. Often these statements are poorly defined, whereas if you keep arguing with them, they won't exactly know what they're saying. But they're incredibly aggressive online. Will denounce anyone who criticizes them, including denouncing me after they hear this podcast. But that's fine. They do that all the time. So what MMT people are is meme warriors. Macro is a meme war because it's so hard to get definitive established facts in macro that essentially things get done by people shouting. And MMT is very good at shouting.
Even Stephanie Kelton, like even the most, the people.
Especially Stephanie Kelton. She's the best at this. Stephanie Kelton is like the ultimate meme lord of MMT. I mean, yes, there's like guys like Nathan Tankus and Rohan Gray, but like, no, Stephanie Kelton is the lord of MMT memeing.
Got it.
Like these people never write down like a formal model of the economy. One time I saw someone do it and it was the most ridiculous thing. It was like, we will compel everyone into slavery and this will be good. And it was just a psychotic. And so that's why they never do it. Because there is no formal model. There's no real theory of MMT. It's just meme war. It's just getting people who might otherwise think, negatively, instinctively about government deficits because they think government's like a household. Look at all this money we're borrowing. And then they might think that. And then, but the MMT people are like, no, debt is good, and come up with all these other memes, which are, frankly bullshit, but they're useful. They're useful for countering people's inherent tendency toward austerity.
Yeah. Interesting. So do they get anything right by accident?
Well, the government's true budget constraint is inflation. That's right. That is attributable to Abba Lerner. So all the stuff MMT people get right is attributable to one guy. His name is Abba Lerner. He did his work in like the early 20th century. He was like, the real government budget constraint is inflation, because if you just have the central bank cover the treasury's debts, the only thing that could go wrong is that people decide that the currency is out of whack and decide to raise prices a lot.
Yeah.
And so that MMT people get that right because Abba Lerner got it right. And Abba Lerner said, once inflation starts, the only way to stop it is austerity. Well, he's wrong about that. But if you're in a situation of fiscal dominance where the Fed's kind of being jerked around by what the Treasury decides to borrow, and the Fed just can't raise interest rates for fear of like spiking the government's borrowing cost and causing a default, because of that, if the Fed actually becomes cowed and starts acting in an MMT-like way, or at least the way they would like the Fed to act, then the only way to stop runaway inflation would be austerity, punishing austerity.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, like, yeah, that's what they get right and wrong.
Yeah. Moving to, and gearing towards to closing in a few minutes, moving towards foreign policy, do you ascribe to or what's your reaction to the Peter Zeihan view of the world, which basically states that it's no longer in America's sort of economic interest to patrol or to maintain the global order, or maybe it was never in their economic interest, but it was in their political interest, and now it's less in their political interest. And so America is going to retreat significantly. And he basically says that countries that depended on, America to maintain the seas, to patrol the seas, China and a few others, are going to really struggle. And countries that did well before the order was imposed are going to do well afterwards.
He says China's going to struggle?
Yeah, China's going to struggle because I think like some large percentage of their oil comes from the Persian Gulf, and we patrol the seas to make it safe. And thus that trade route isn't going to be, they're going to struggle.
That's no problem. China will just build a navy. They already have a big navy. That's not going to happen. But he's absolutely right that the United States does not have the size to be the hegemon anymore. And of course we have internal divisions too, but even if we didn't have those, we're just too small. Like China is 4 times as big as us. Once they grow, we're just a small country then. India is 4 times as big as us as well. Together, those countries are 8 times as big as the United States, actually a little more. And so we can't keep mastery over the world. We could keep mastery over the world when it was just, poor countries and then some small European and like East Asian countries, maybe some Gulf countries. But now when China like outclasses us in terms of total GDP size, we can't patrol them. See, I don't get what Zeihan's saying. It's like, actually, no, the problem is it's not going to be China the loser. It's going to be China replacing us in some places.
Yeah.
So I think that, yes, America will retreat. Yes. No, China will not lose out from that.
Got it. Saving the best for last, perhaps. If you want to make predictions here, what's going to be the legacy of Biden economics?
Oh, yeah. So Bidenomics, I think, is going to be 3 things. So the first one is going to be cash benefits. And it's really Mnuchinomics, because Mnuchin came up with the biggest cash benefits in the CARES Act. But thanks, Mnuchin. I think it's going to be lastingly associated with Biden, just like Carter actually deregulated, but like deregulation is associated with Reagan because he preached it so much. I think that cash benefits will be associated with Biden, and that, in the tech world, of course, which I think a lot of your listeners, everybody knows about basic income and the basic income experiment in Stockton, and just sort of the general idea that like cash is better than in-kind benefits or whatever, and unconditional cash is best. I think that's going to be associated with Bidenomics. I think this idea of care jobs, this idea of like, well, what can humans do? Well, we can take care of each other in old folks' homes and hospitals, whatever, psychotherapists, I don't know, any care job, or just assisted living, I don't know. And I think the third thing is going to be investment. It was definitely time for government to start investing again. That's the one I'm worried about, though, because of the gutting of science research funding in the early rounds of some of these bills. But if Biden succeeds, if Biden sticks to his guns, such as they are, I believe that investment will go down as the third pillar of Bidenomics: investment, care jobs, and cash.
Yeah, that's a great note to wrap on. I highly recommend people check out the Substack, also the podcast Hexatopia. Is that what it's called?
Hexapodia. It's like 6 feet.
Yeah, and any
other
other
sci-fi novel.
Oh yeah, of course. Any other plugs you want to leave us with?
No. I mean, you can go. My Substack has a free email list, so you don't have to give me money. You can just subscribe to that free email list at Noahpinion, which is the name of my Substack. But yeah.
Yeah, and we just scratched the surface on a bunch of them. It goes much deeper, and there's a lot there, and the paid posts are great as well. Noah, thanks for coming on the podcast. It's a great episode.
Thanks so much for having me on. Always great to be here.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Check us out at villageglobal.vc.